Hey, what's up YouTube? Yu-Gi-Oh! Trader 101 here, and I know it's been way too long since I last made a video. A lot of it has had to do with me just, quite frankly, not having as much time as I would like to make videos, and one thing is my laptop broke, so I haven't been able to put anything on my computer to upload it. I've had my phone, but I've been trying to be a little bit more sophisticated with my videos. I wanted to kind of do some editing in the beginning with my laptop, but then it broke, so I had no motivation to make videos. But since I just topped YCS Seattle this past weekend, I thought it would be fair to make a deck profile on my channel. I know there's a couple other deck profiles out there on a few channels, but I always like having a deck profile on my own channel, even though I've kind of neglected it over the past few months. Real life is kind of coming up. I'm just applying to grad school right now, going next year. Life is coming, so I haven't had as much time to make videos as I would like. Anyway, enough of that. Let's just get right into the deck profile. In Seattle, I decided to play Dino Rabbit. I haven't thought it was much of a good deck this format, but with the release of the Mermail deck, I thought it, with main deck Macrocosmos, would have an incredible matchup against that deck, and has always been a reasonable enough choice to play at the events, regardless of the other matchups. So I decided to go back to Dino Rabbit, even though I haven't played it this format. So, of course, we're going to go with the obligatory 6 normal monsters, 3 Cavazols, 3 Sabersaurs. I ran 3 copies of Dirac Gwaiba. I'm going to go through all the monsters, and then I'll describe and explain all of my choices. Of course, 2 copies of Rescue Rabbit, 2 copies of Tour Guide, 2 copies of Spirit Reaper, a Sanguine, and a Night Assailant. So the cards that are probably worth talking about would be the 3 Gwaibas, the 2 Spirit Reapers, and the Night Assailant. First of all, let's talk about Gwaiba. A lot of people think, or a lot of people argue, that Thunder King is a better choice than Gwaiba in the Dino Rabbit deck. And I totally acknowledge how powerful of a card Thunder King is, especially in the current format against the Water deck, against Windups, against Kirji Armor, against a variety of decks, against Chaos Dragons. It really is one of the most powerful normal summon beater monsters in the format. However, in all of my playtesting with Dino Rabbit, and I've playtested for numerous events, numerous formats, numerous times when certain decks are popular, I've really come to the conclusion that the fact that Dirac Gwaiba is a dinosaur is something that you just cannot overlook when comparing Gwaiba to Thunder King. There are so many times with this deck that you'll have a hand where you have a Sabersaurus, a Cabazols, and a Gwaiba, something along those lines, or 1 normal monster and a Gwaiba. And the fact that Gwaiba is a dinosaur allows you to set up plays so that you can stabilize with a Lagia or a Dolka when your hand isn't necessarily as explosive as opening Rabbit or opening Tour Guide or having any of those type of plays. This is a really pacey, tempo-ish type of deck, and it's a control-y deck, and a lot of time you're not going to have Rescue Rabbit, you're not going to have Tour Guide, you're not going to have a lot of the power plays that this deck has. So what you need to do with a big trap lineup and some of the protective spells and trap cards you run is you need to utilize the fact that Gwaiba is a dinosaur with your normal monsters to create game states that are favorable for you and that really push the tempo in your favor. The fact that Gwaiba itself can also, of course, turn into Lagia and Dolka through the use of Book of Moon and Lance, or even attacking weaker monsters, is just pushing it far over the edge. And something that a lot of people argue is that since Thunder King shuts down certain decks, it's more favorable. But one of the main things that I've come across is that Thunder King with back rows tends to be similar to Gwaiba, Cabazol, Sabersaurus, and Resolved Rescue Rabbits with back rows. So a lot of the time, the fact that Gwaiba just is a big 1700 body, and you have a decent amount of spell and traps, Solemn Warning, Dimensional Prism Automas, things like that, it really almost has a pseudo-same effect of Thunder King shutting down your opponent as just a big, reasonable attack strength monster with trap cards shutting down your opponent. So I've come to the conclusion after all of these times running Dino Rabbit that I think Gwaiba is just way too important to cut. The first time I ever ran Dino Rabbit was at YCS Atlanta earlier this year in the format before March, and I ran 3 Gwaibas and 2 Thunder Kings, and ever since then I've cut the Thunder Kings and I've had 3 Gwaibas in all of my decks at all 6 events that I've run this deck. So 3 Gwaibas are completely necessary in my opinion. 2 Spirit Reapers. This is another thing that kind of goes along the line of big beater monsters, and this is kind of the spot where a lot of people would consider running Thunder King. I think Spirit Reaper is better than Thunder King in this deck because it allows you to alternate between the game plans that you impose during the game. For example, Thunder King is a normal summon monster. I mean, very rarely you're going to set Thunder King. Of course, there will be times you set Thunder King, but for the most part, it's just another normal summon. Like Gwaiba, Sabersaurus, Cabazols, Rescue Rabbit, Tour Guide, and Thunder King are all monsters you're generally just going to normal summon. They're beaters. You try and push through over monsters, use your spell and trap cards to protect them. But what Spirit Reaper allows you to do is it allows you, of course, to set the Spirit Reaper in a lot more advantageous way than setting Thunder King. What Spirit Reaper allows you to do is it allows you to stabilize when you're looking at big monsters and don't necessarily have the removal you want. It allows you when you're in an unfavorable position to set a monster that can be very difficult for a lot of decks this format to get over. And with the Spirit Reaper, the fact that it's level 3 puts in a lot of work. It lets you exceed into the more favorable numbers as opposed to what Thunder King does. And like I said earlier, with the whole, you already have enough normal summoned monsters. You don't necessarily always need Thunder King in 4 back rows. Sabersaurus in 4 back rows does almost the exact same thing a very high percentage of the time. I'm talking like 85-90% of the time. It's almost identical in terms of how it shuts down the opponent. What the Reaper allows you to do is when you have the hands where you have a Gwaiba, a Kabazal, Sabersaurus, those type of monsters, or one of those monsters, and a Spirit Reaper, it's not always the best play to just go summon my beater, set a bunch of back rows. Sometimes you really can't afford to lose a monster to Torrential or Bottomless or Stall Morning, and you need to set the Spirit Reaper to try and stabilize and progress the game into a state where you're allowed to summon another monster, but have the face down or the face up Spirit Reaper stabilizing and protecting yourselves. I've just found the Spirit Reaper been one of the more important cards in this deck, in this current format, in this current build. And then I run the Night Assailant just because I want to be able to Tour Guide twice without... I don't play Pot of Avarice, so the real reason, it really is there to replace the Tour Guide. So, obviously it's not as good, but it's the best that we can do right now. So that's the monster lineup. For the spells, I'm running 3 copies of Forbidden Lance, 2 copies of Mystical Space Typhoon, 2 copies of Soul Taker, one of the big 3, Reborn, Heavy, and Dark Hole, and then a copy of Book of Moon. Things worth noting in here, 2 Soul Takers. I've been playing some form of 1-for-1 monster removal in this deck for quite some time. Originally it was Smashing Ground, and then it kind of progressed to Soul Taker once this has really found itself to be better than Smashing Ground with the release of cards like Light Pulsar Dragon and the Shining and the popularity of those type of cards. So I replaced Smashing Ground with Soul Taker a long time ago. Really no need to go into explain that. But again, I decided in this format Soul Taker is a unique card because it's an out to a card like Hyperion. I found Hyperion to be a real problem with this deck because all of your answers are proactive, like Dimensional Prisons and things along those lines. Very few cards in your deck can you draw to deal with an onboard Hyperion. As a matter of fact, if they have fairies in the graveyard, there's virtually nothing you can draw other than Dark Hole. So the card that, like Soul Taker, some people cut it down to 0 or 1 and they don't play it. Some people play 2. I really think 2 is an important number because you need to deal with cards like Hyperion. And the fact that this deck has a difficulty getting over big monsters in the first place is just another reason why the double Soul Taker has been something I've always advocated and will continue to advocate in this deck. But Hyperion being popular in this format is one of like the main big reason. I even play this in Heroes because I found that problem. So definitely big on the double Soul Taker. Double MST. I decided not to play the third MST because I was afraid of the Trapless Agents that Simon He played at the previous event. I was also afraid of Chaos Dragons, 2 of my inherently worst matchups, and I didn't want to have 3 MSTs in my deck when the functionality of 2 MSTs against all of the other matchups are almost... You almost can't tell the difference between 2 and 3 MSTs against all of the other matchups. I mean, it's really not that great going first. It's much better going second when you're trying to push through a play. So it's a versatile card. It always has been a versatile card, but you're really not going to notice the difference between 2 and 3 unless you're playing against a matchup, so you don't want to see it at all. So I went with 2. And then 3 copies of Lance. I've always think Lance is one of the most important cards in this deck. Has always been and always will be. It allows you to push Guaibas through. It allows you to protect your Dolkas. It basically turns your Dolkas into Lagias because you can negate the Dark Hole, the Soul Taker, the Smashing Ground, Prison, all of those cards. It allows your Lagias to maintain negations. It allows you to get over bigger monsters with your normal monsters. It's just been one of the most versatile cards. I'd play more than 3 if I was allowed to. For the traps, it's the exact same trap lineup that I played at this year's Nationals. It's pretty self-explanatory from last format. Really no changes. The double Warning, the double Bottomless. Of course, since I designed this deck has always been geared towards being favorable against the normal matchup. There's 2 Macrocosmoses, 2 Torrential Tributes. I guess I can talk about this card because I always get asked about this when I show deck profiles of Rabbit. Double Dimensional Prison, and then 1 Road, 1 Solemn Judgment, and a Compulse. A lot of people ask, why do you play Torrential Tribute in this deck? And they always argue that, well, with Lagia, you want trap cards, and you don't want this to be one of the trap cards. Well, with this type of deck, a lot of your game is going to be grindy. You don't always open Rescue Rabbit, and as a matter of fact, you very rarely open Rescue Rabbit, and during the course of the weekend, in the 11 rounds that I played, I only won 2 die rolls, literally 2 die rolls. So I was really never in a position to just kind of, open the nuts and win because of it. I never won the die roll, went first and opened Rabbit the whole weekend. I had just, the vast majority of my games are just grindy, battle of resources type games, and Torrential Tribute's one of the best cards, and because it just punishes poor players, you can set up plays with Sang and Zen main, or this or that. And another reason is I'm running the 2 copies of Spirit Reaper. It's a card that opens up the board for my Reapers. Torrential Tribute has just always been a card that I felt was important in this deck because it's just such a versatile card in terms of being able to not necessarily protect your Lagia, but when the situation when you don't have Lagia and you're just trying to stabilize with your hand of normal monsters, one of the best ways of doing so is to bait them into a Torrential and then re-establish board presence with a normal monster. That's one of the best ways to transition between having a poor hand with normal monsters and Guaibas or multiple Guaibas and things like that, clearing the board and then being able to stabilize from there. On to the side deck. I sided 2 copies of Snowman Eater because I thought the mirror match would be pretty prevalent this weekend, and a lot of Dino Rabbit decks did top, or at least a handful. This format's very versatile, or very, what's the word I'm looking for? Diverse. So 5 or 6 Dino Rabbit decks is quite a handful in terms of how diverse this format is. But I played the 2 Snowman Eaters. I always side this card in this deck. It's always good against heroes too and stuff like that. 2 copies of Maxi. I don't main any hand traps, so I really felt like I wanted them in the wind-up matchup. 1 copy of Gores. I tend to side Gores in a lot of my decks. I sided in Zectors. This is one of those type of cards where, since I'm playing macro, a lot of people don't expect me to ever have access to Gores. And I like Gores against A, players that I think will play into Gores, B, against decks like Heroes, Dino Rabbit, and matchups like that, in aggressive decks like Chaos Dragon and things along those lines. So I always like having access to Gores. It's just one of the best cards that's ever been printed in the game, and not having access to it in your 15-card side and 40-plus card main, I just think is silly. I told a lot of people I wouldn't play Thunder King, and I still advocate that it's not necessarily the greatest card in this deck, just because I think Guaiba outclasses it. But there are matchups where, even though the fact that Guaiba is a dinosaur, you are going to side Guaiba out, just because it's very difficult to get his effect off against something like Heroes, for example. It's in a hero matchup, because the attack threshold on your opponent is generally about 1900. A card like Thunder King is going to be better than Guaiba, so that is a matchup where you're going to side the Guaibas out, because a lot of the times it'll be more difficult to try and stabilize through the use of the Guaibas turning into Lagias and Dolkas, because they have so much removal and you have so much removal that that type of game state just doesn't usually occur. So a card like Thunder King is just a little bit better because it has the 19 and it doesn't need any other protection to deal with the fact that all of their monsters are essentially 1900. So there are just other matchups where I'm siding Guaibas out and I want another monster to normal summon, and this was just the second tier of normal monsters to summon, in my opinion, below Guaiba. So I wanted at least, what is the 15th card I put in my side deck after I ran some numbers in terms of what I'd side in certain matchups. Double Lemma Limit, 1 MST, of course the third one, 2 Noble Man for the Gear Gear matchup, 2 copies of Dust Tornado, a Needle Ceiling, and a Macrocosmos. Macro is self-explanatory. Needle Ceiling for windups. The double Dust Tornado actually came in against the Water deck because I was expecting them, of course, to have their spears, but then, of course, they're going to have cards like Gozen Match, things along those lines. So I really wanted to have the Dust Tornadoes because I didn't want to lose to Gozen Match. I didn't want to lose, or at least not necessarily lose, but be able to counteract their spears and things along those lines. Noble Mans are self-explanatory. Everything else is pretty self-explanatory. And then the extra deck, it's a pretty simple extra deck. There's 1 or 2 things I can comment about. Of course, there's a Zen Mains, Utopia, there's a Temtempo, Maestroke, Acid Golem. Some people cut this in this deck, but it's 3000 beater, and it's one of those cards that, since this deck has such a difficulty getting over big monsters, I always want access to Acid Golem. I didn't go into it this weekend, but it's just one of those cards where whenever I cut it, I always regret cutting it, so I just keep adding it back. Papal Imperative, I added Gaga Cowboy over Gemini Pro, which was in here, kind of as a counteract the getting over monsters over 2500, like Gemini Pro was able to, plus the situations when they have Gozen Match. Leviathan Dragon, 2 Dolkas, 2 Lagias, 2 Leviers. This is kind of something I was on the fence about until just about the last minute. Over testing the past couple of weeks, there's been a handful of times I've wanted the double Levier. And if I went into this event, needed double Levier, and only played 1, I was going to regret it forever. The thing is, this deck doesn't play Pot of Avarice, and the deck plays Macrocosmos. So there's going to be a lot of monsters removed from play, so it's a little bit more useful because you have a little bit more variety. You have a lot more of their monsters involved in what you want to Levier. And if I ever lose my Levier and I need it later in the game, there's no Pot of Avarice, there's no way of bringing it back. So I wanted to play the 2 Leviers. The monster I was considering playing over Levier was Abyss Dweller, and since the only level 4 monster I have access to other than through Monster Reborn was Thunder King from the side deck, anytime I could go into a rank 4, I could go into Lagia or Dolka against like the Water deck or something like that. So I always decided that, or I had decided that Dolka and Lagia, the ability to go into those anytime I would want to go into Abyss Dweller was just simply not needed. So I didn't play the Abyss Dweller, I played the second Levier instead. So yeah, that's about it. Thanks for watching, guys. You can look on Alt Reality Games for an article about this, my whole tournament, explaining all the rounds, talking about my quite dreadful savage beating in the feature match. And this came out, I think it's kind of cool. It's an ARG token. And he has a Stratos. I don't know, I thought it was pretty cool. I have a bunch of them, so if anyone in my local area wants one, I just have like 1,000,000 of them, so I think that's pretty cool. But yeah, check Alt Reality Games for an upcoming article, and maybe I'll make some more videos when I fix my computer, which is hopefully soon. Thank you for watching.